On this episode of Death Row Stories, in rural Ohio, a shocking double murder.
It was just unbelievable that in this quiet little neighborhood, something would happen.
An elderly couple murdered at their kitchen table.
There was no sign of a struggle.
There were no signs of forced entry.
As if they knew their attacker.
The case goes cold.
You don't want to have unsolved murder cases.
Until the DA hunts down 4 likely suspects.
These were lost boys.
23 years later, is an innocent man on death row?
He said, "I'm begging you to spare my life. Maybe someday the truth will come out."
There's a body on the water.
He was butchered and murdered.
Many people proclaim their innocence.
In this case, there are a number of things that stink.
This man is remorseless.
He needs to pay for it with his life.
The electric chair flashed in front of my eyes.
Get a conviction at all costs. Let the truth fall where it may.
Saturday, April 7th, 1990. It is approximately 8:33 p.m.
On a Saturday afternoon, my dispatch called me and advised me that there had been a crime committed, a murder.
In the remote Ohio town of Atwater, 81-year-old Cora and Bernhard Hardig were discovered shot to death at their kitchen table.
A neighbor was surprised that the Hardigs' garage door was open and there was a tractor outside. And then he called the sheriff's office because Mr. Hardig apparently cleaned everything and put everything away every night.
Watch your language, you got tape on there.
Police entered a crime scene that was absolutely grisly. The Hardigs were found in the kitchen. Cora was shot 5 times. Bernhard 3 times. They were terribly discolored, bloated. They were unrecognizable.
Bernhard Hardig had worked at the deli counter of a supermarket before retiring. Cora was a homemaker.
Cora and Bernhard were known to be fastidious folks. Bernhard kept his lawn pristine. Everything was in its place. I remember seeing a photo of them. She's leaning into him, and he looks proud as a high school senior with his prom date.
They kept to themselves. They were good neighbors from what we were told. It was just unbelievable that in this quiet little neighborhood, something would happen to them of, this degree.
We believe, money was the motive. That's our speculation at this point.
Despite the grisly scene, the killer left no fingerprints or footprints. All police found were a cigarette butt in the driveway and some shell casings. The shell casings would lead police to their prime suspects. In the days leading up to the murders, 4 young men had been on a crime spree in Alliance, Ohio, 10 miles away. 14-year-old Butch Walcott, 18-year-old Joey D'Alessandro, 21-year-old Gary Sinclair, and their leader, 18-year-old Tyrone Noling.
They started with just car larceny type things. They would take change out of ashtrays and CB radios. They were known to cause problems, just little troublemakers.
2 days before the Hardigs were killed, Tyrone persuaded Gary St. Clair to join him in burglarizing neighborhood homes.
They had this ruse. They went in, asked the people if they could use their phone, and then they took stuff from them, rings and jewelry and all kinds of stuff.
They took everything that wasn't nailed down. At the first house, Tyrone found a .25 caliber weapon and uses it the next day, April 5th, in the second robbery.
Detectives were initially interested in them as suspects in the Hardig murder because a .25 caliber pistol was used to kill the Hardigs. that same day.
They were trying to get money to buy cigarettes, video games, and snacks, and get high.
Butch and Gary had met at a homeless shelter. Joey and Tyrone were friends from childhood. All 4 boys had been crashing at a friend's house, unsupervised, broke, and bored.
Tyrone and the others were lost boys. They were drifters in their own lives, and they drifted together. They were living kind of a Lord of the Flies life in this empty home where there were no parents and no rules, no plans, and no life.
Police arrested all 4 boys for the robberies 4 days after the Hardigs were murdered. Tyrone and Gary immediately confessed. Butch and Joey, who didn't participate in the burglaries, were released.
Both Tyrone and Gary were in jail on the Alliance robberies. Detectives went down, interviewed both of them about the Hardig murder. Both of them were denied involvement.
Police also ran a ballistics test on the gun they took from Tyrone.
Bureau of Criminal Investigation excluded it as the murder weapon, 100%. That gun was not the gun that was used to kill the Hardigs.
Taken from the driveway of the Hardig home was a cigarette butt. And this got great attention because the Hardigs didn't smoke.
I tested the saliva present on the cigarette butt and determined a blood type. It indicated that all 4 suspects could not be the source of the saliva.
After that, they had to be ruled out as suspects. Tyrone Noling went on to serve his time for the robberies he'd admitted to. Gary did the same, 5 to 25 years.
I do not think that these boys were capable of that. These boys had just done mischievous crimes, so to speak. I never thought it was them.
With no leads or eyewitnesses, the Hardigs' murder went cold.
I try to disconnect myself from the outside world because it's the only way I can deal with it in me. It's the only way I can cope with it.
In 1992, 2 years into his burglary sentence, Tyrone was visited in prison by investigators in the Hardig case. They delivered shocking news.
Detective says I'm being charged with 2 first-degree murders.
What was your reaction?
What would your reaction be? It was like, you gotta be kidding me. These people are crazy.
Hi, is this David Norris?
Yes, it is.
Hi, sir. This is Andrea Samakis calling from the Plain Dealer.
Right.
Journalist Andrea Samakis interviewed Portage County prosecuting attorney David Norris about the Hardig case.
You don't want to have unsolved murder cases.
Right.
When you only got 3 or 4 a year, you want to do everything possible to solve it.
To reinvestigate the case, Norris assigned Ron Craig, a former police detective who had helped win several convictions.
Investigator Ron Craig has a reputation, one that is aggressive.
He would get a hold of a case and he wouldn't let go of it, and that's what happened here.
I just told Ron, take the file, look at it, snoop around, do whatever you got to do, because I want to make sure that we've done everything we can do on this.
Ron Craig and I went to school together, played football together. He's been called a bully. He tried to bully me, okay, even when I was sheriff.
Once Ron Craig was brought onto the case, things started moving very quickly.
Within several weeks, they focused exclusively on Tyrone Noling, Butch Wolcott, Gary St. Clair, Joey D'Alessandro.
Tyrone and Gary were serving out their sentences for robbery. Joey D'Alessandro was in jail on a drug charge, while Butch Wolcott was back at home. Ron Craig started by going after 16-year-old Butch.
They said, we're pretty certain that you gentlemen were involved with a murder.
Ron Craig told Butch his DNA was found at the crime scene, told him a man on a utility pole had seen him committing the crime. On the one hand, he was facing life in jail. On the other hand, the state was offering complete immunity.
I was advised by everybody in my family to cooperate at all costs. Yeah, I cooperated.
Butch agreed to testify that his 3 friends had committed the Hardig murders.
After Ron Craig gets Butch to agree, Ron Craig also gets Gary St. Clair and Joey D'Alessandro to agree to confess to the crimes and finger Tyrone Noling as the trigger man. Ron Craig basically convinced them to testify against Tyrone Noling to save themselves.
By August of 1995, Craig had arranged plea deals with Gary and Joey. Tyrone Noling was indicted for the aggravated murder of the Hardigs, a charge that carried the death penalty.
The person who hired me was Tyrone Noling's defense attorney. I never have done a death penalty case before this case. This was the first time.
As Tyrone's defense prepared for trial, they brought on investigator Vicki Buckwalter.
Vicki Buckwalter, I believe, cracked the Tyrone Noling case wide open.
I got a pile of statements from the co-defendants of Tyrone Noling. And it seemed that the more evidence that came to light in this case, their statements would suddenly change to kind of match the evidence.
Vicki concentrated on Gary St. Clair, who had agreed to plead guilty to his involvement in the murders in exchange for a 23-to-life sentence.
He's their star witness because he supposedly is in the house with Tyrone. He's the eyewitness, the only eyewitness to this murder. We went up there and talked to him, and we couldn't turn the tape recorder on fast enough. I mean, he just told a story, and we just listened to it.
Vicki Buckwalter and her partner, they talked to me, about the murder case, and they pretty much wanted me to go in the courtroom and lie.
He said, I don't know what to do. And I said, Gary, I'm not your attorney, and I cannot tell you what to do, but the truth is always the best thing.
Vicki Buckwalter's a hard-working lady. I trust her. She talked me into it, told the truth at Tyrone Noling's trial.
He said, I'm going to tell the truth.
As Tyrone Noling's trial loomed, his defense team uncovered several facts that seemed to challenge the prosecution's case.
When you compare the crimes of the Hardig murders to the crimes of the robberies and Alliance, you see a world of difference.
The evidence at the crime scene suggests both Bernhard and Cora were shot while sitting around the kitchen table. There were no signs of forced entry.
There was no sign of a struggle. It appeared as if they knew their attacker.
In the Alliance robberies, they were after jewelry, cash, electronics. Those things were left in plain sight in the Hardig murder. All of the Alliance robberies were within walking distance of the house that they were staying at. They would run through the backyard, commit a robbery, and then run back to this house. The Hardigs lived miles away, the next county over, about a 20 or 30-minute drive, completely out in the middle of nowhere.
Police also didn't find fingerprints, any trace evidence, not blood, not hair.
When the boys did the 2 robberies, they went in with no masks, easily recognizable, left their fingerprints all over the place. All these things that you would expect from kids who had no idea what they were doing.
On January 8, 1996, Tyrone's death penalty trial began.
There is no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The evidence against him is largely resting on the testimony of his 3 alleged accomplices, Butch Walcott, Joey D'Alessandro, and Gary St. Clair.
The prosecution called Butch Walcott to the stand. Now 20 years old, Butch testified that Joey drove them to the town of Atwater, where Tyrone chose the Hardig's house to rob. Joey D'Alessandro confirmed Butch's testimony, saying they waited in his car while Tyrone and Gary committed the murders.
Joey testifies about seeing Tyrone run from the Hardig ranch with a smoking gun in his hand. I mean, this was dramatic testimony.
Next, it was Gary St. Clair's turn to testify, but on the stand, he stunned the courtroom.
I told the jury and the judge that Mr. Noling didn't have anything to do with the murder case, he didn't kill nobody. And the prosecutor jumped out of his chair. The prosecutor had no idea that I was going to say that we're innocent of this murder case. He had no idea.
This was the guy who was supposedly in the house with Tyrone. Joey and Butch were supposedly waiting in the car as the story went. He's not going to testify against Tyrone. Imagine the drama of this.
The judge called a break or something. We ended up going to a small room, and I told the prosecutor. He came and asked me why I did that. I said, well, I'm telling the truth. And I said, Ron Craig, you want me to lie for his benefit and the prosecutor's benefit to get the case over with.
The prosecutor responded by telling Gary his goose was cooked. He was done.
After this happened, we go back in the courtroom. The prosecutor started to talk to me, as a hostile witness.
The prosecution read to the jury a sworn statement Gary had made, describing in detail how Tyrone committed the murders. At trial, Gary said he only agreed to cooperate after being threatened with the death penalty.
I'm gonna make sure I max him out on everything if I don't testify against him. There'd been a maximum sentence on every charge.
And even with that risk, you decided to tell the truth.
Yeah, even with the risk, I told the truth for this murder case.
And why did you do that?
Well, I told the truth. If the day would come where Tyrone Noling would get, put to death, it won't be on my conscience. I care the rest of my life if he got put to death. I don't want to have that. I want to, to just tell the truth.
After Gary's testimony, he returned to prison to serve out his sentence for the Hardig murders. Joey D'Alessandro pled guilty to a lesser charge and got 5 to 15 years. On January 23, 1996, the jury returned its verdict for Tyrone Noling.
I was so confident that this guy, he's innocent, he's never going to get convicted. I think I was naive in a lot of ways.
The trial ended with Tyrone Noling being found guilty of the murders of Cora and Bernhard Hardig. Tyrone Noling was sentenced to death. The judge asked the condemned man if he had anything to say. Tyrone Noling said, "The crime he was convicted of was sick, hideous. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do it, and I'm begging you to spare my life. Someday," he said, before his knees gave way and he had to sit down, "maybe someday the truth will come out."
With Tyrone Noling sentenced to death, defense investigator Vicky Buckwalter tracked down his remaining accusers. For his cooperation, Joey D'Alessandro had received a reduced sentence of 5 to 15 years. Butch Walcott received immunity and went free.
I started out with Butch first. I knocked on his door, and I told him that I thought he had things confused, that he didn't actually do these murders. He looked at me like the weight of the world was just had been lifted off of his shoulders.
I always wanted to tell the truth, just didn't realize that I could.
And what made you realize you could?
Vicky Buckwalter. That's my angel. And maybe she's Tyrone's angel. She might be all of our angels.
He said, I wasn't there at the murders. I knew what was going on, and I know that none of us were there.
Butch, just 16 years old at the time, described how he was pressured into lying in court by the prosecution's investigator, Ron Craig.
I was interrogated for 90 hours. He wouldn't let my dad in.
None of the things that Ron Craig told Butch Walcott that he had on him were true, but cops are allowed to lie to folks they have in the interrogation room, and he did.
They said they found my DNA in a cigarette butt. It was all lies. I feel like such a fool. You have no idea how much of a fool I feel.
Ron Craig knew very well that Butch be easiest link to flip on his murder case. He's young, about 14 years old. Younger you are, I guess easier to scare.
One time, he took me to the bathroom. He opened the door. He said, "Step in." And he closed the door. I'm standing here in the middle of the dark. A few seconds went by. He opens the door and he flips the switch. And he said, "See how everything is here now? That's the difference between you telling that little white lie and not. Flip that switch off, there's nothing there." When they have the power of life and death in their hands, trust me, that's really scary.
He was coached. He learned things about the crime scene through being left in a room with evidence files.
Photographs started getting shown. Slid them right over to me. "Do you recognize this?" "Nope." But they did this 7, 8, 10 times.
At one point, Butch was taken back to the crime scene. Ron Craig felt that it would jog his memory. And of course, once they take him to the crime scene, he can now describe the house.
As we're driving, we start slowing down. He's up in his rearview mirror. He's looking up at the house, looks back down at me. "Do you recognize this?" And even as a youngster, I could pay attention to cues. It's that house. That's it. I know how Craig is at this point. He expects results.
With Butch now cooperating, Ron Craig next turned to Joey D'Alessandro.
Joey said, "My mom told me that if I didn't plead, she would never come to visit me in prison." His dad wanted him to plead. They felt like if they pled, at least they could try to get out on appeals.
Joey, he lied too. He got scared by Ron Craig. Because I remember bringing transcripts saying he was scared. They threw him to the death penalty.
Gary was the last domino to fall. Prosecutor's office took the road of the least resistance, and that's why they went after these boys.
Having obtained sworn recantations from all three of Tyrone's accomplices, in 1997, Tyrone's defense appealed his conviction.
Recantations are looked at with suspicion. The idea is, well, wait a minute. We've got guys who have admitted to us that they've lied. How can we take anything they say seriously? The problem with that logic, as far as I'm concerned, is when they give you good reason for the lie.
And the way to figure out which of those things is true is to look at which one of those stories better matches the facts. Which one was made under duress. And in this case, I think all three recantations are more credible than the original inculpatory statements that Joey, Butch, and Gary offered to the prosecution.
Despite these arguments, the court denied Tyrone's appeal. Disappointed but undeterred, Tyrone's defense now turned to other evidence that could compel a rehearing of his case.
When I started looking into the case, I uncovered in my reporting, there was another suspect very early on that actually made more sense than Tyrone Noling or any of his associates.
Mr. Hardig had a reputation as being generous in loaning money to friends and acquaintances.
Before the murder, Mr. Hardig had been having a money dispute with an insurance salesman, a man named Louis Lehman. They had loaned Lehman $10,000. The loan had come due. Mr. Hardig was mistrustful of banks, and he had kept sort of a large amount of cash on him that he would loan out to friends.
During their investigation, police were approached by the Hardig's doctor, who said that just before Bernhardt was murdered, he'd complained about his loan to Louis Lehman.
Dr. Canone said, Mr. Hardig was extremely upset and said, as soon as I get off the phone with you, I'm going to call him and set this straight. That's the last anyone ever heard from the Hardigs.
in the living room. The papers on the floor in disarray.
There were papers strewn around the house, open drawers. Certain parts of the house had been ransacked, but there were also valuables in plain sight that weren't taken.
We always contended somebody came in there who knew the Hartigs. They shot the Hartigs, and then they did a concentrated search for something. Perhaps paperwork that showed that there was indeed a loan.
Detectives brought Louis Lehman in for questioning. Mr. Lehman owned a .25 caliber pistol that could have been used to kill the Hartigs. And when they asked him what happened to that weapon, he said he didn't remember. They asked him to take a polygraph examination, and he refused.
That was pretty much the end of the interview, and he just kind of disappeared off of the radar with them.
Once the prosecutor's office took over the investigation, there's no other mention of Lehman in any of the records that have been uncovered so far.
Lehman died in 1994, and Tyrone's team was never able to question him. But the defense would soon learn about another suspect, a suspect who actually admitted to killing the Hardys.
Wilson was a young man who actually lived in a foster home very close to the Hardig home.
Nathan Chesley lived with Dan Wilson for 2 years.
I was 16 years old when I moved into that foster home and met Dan Wilson. Dan was like an older brother, I think would be the best way to define our relationship, but one that didn't have much fun involved. He would teach me things like working on cars. It was either work or he would be drunk and he would make me do work. He was a bully.
Wilson had a juvenile record like Tyrone Noling, but his was deadly.
When Wilson was 14 years old, he beat an 81-year-old man to death and served time in juvenile detention for the murder.
He was already killing people. This is just what he did. One Sunday night, Dan came home about 1 a.m. and he was drunk, and then wake me up out of bed, and he had me go in the garage with him. When Dan was drunk, he had like a split personality, and his voice would change. He would be a totally different person. When he had me out in the garage, he was explaining that he killed the Hardigs and that he had shot them. Dan didn't give me any reason why he did it because he's talking in the third person. So he's like excited, he's like, do you see what Dan did? Definitely boasting. He actually used his hand like he was pulling a trigger. And it scared the shit out of me. I'm just telling you the truth. He just eventually fell asleep, and that's how I was able to get out of there. The next morning, I started asking him questions. Why would you kill the Hardigs? What was the deal? And his face turned white as a ghost, and he starts choking me on the wall. And he's like, how do I know this? Have I been following him? Was I there? How do I know all this stuff? I couldn't breathe. He's trying to kill me.
The woman who ran the foster home pulled Dan off Nathan, and he managed to escape.
I went to school, and I explained to the principal that I knew who killed the Hardigs. I was very emotional. We sat down, and he said that he was going to be contacting the police. I told him, you can do whatever you want to do. I'm not going to be here anyway. Dan was going to kill me, whether I told on him or not.
Nathan hit the road, eventually becoming a long-haul truck driver. He never spoke to Dan Wilson again.
The police have never tried to contact me about this case. No investigator, no detective, nobody.
The police end up not following up on that thread or connecting it until Dan Wilson is ultimately arrested for this murder several counties over.
In 1991, Daniel Wilson was implicated in the murder of a young woman.
Carolyn Lutz. He met her in a bar, and he took her in her car and threw her in the trunk of the car and lit it, and she burned alive. That's the kind of man Dan Wilson is.
Carol Lutz was murdered 13 months after the Hardigs. Dan Wilson was convicted of her murder in 1992. He was executed by lethal injection in June 2009.
When I found out that he got executed, I just assumed it was the Hardicks. But then I found out that it wasn't for the Hardicks. And that like blew my mind, but I didn't know what to do, you know, because he's already dead. What do you? And then I didn't piece it in my mind together that there was somebody else who's actually on death row for what he did.
The government has an obligation to turn over evidence of innocence in order for defendants to receive a fair trial. Police knew Dan Wilson's blood type was consistent with the blood type on the cigarette butt prior to Tyrone Noling's trial. There's plenty of evidence that Tyrone Noling is innocent, and the jury just never heard any of it.
In 2010, Tyrone's defense began filing appeals, arguing that the jury never heard about the alternate suspects. Additionally, recent advances in DNA technology could help prove Tyrone's innocence.
There's other evidence that we know was touched by the perpetrator and that we know has never been DNA tested.
There were shell casings found at the scene. They also found ring boxes that had been pawed through.
In 1993, the technology was not sensitive enough to pick up DNA left by someone touching an object. Over the last 25 years, the technology has improved exponentially. It's now routine for state laboratories to get full DNA profiles off of something that someone has just touched for a few seconds. DNA testing on those ring boxes and the shell casings could be actually compared to these alternate suspects, Louis Lehman or Dan Wilson.
All right. We will now proceed with case number 11-0778, State versus Noling.
In 2013, Tyrone's defense attorneys, Brian Howe and Kerry Wood, began arguing their case in front of the Ohio Supreme Court, requesting that additional DNA testing be conducted.
Of the now well over 300 DNA exonerations, 10 are capital defendants. And so a denial of DNA testing would at least result in some arbitrariness in the imposition of the death penalty.
In a series of hearings over a period of years, State Prosecutor Victor Viglucci argued against any additional DNA testing or the possibility of a new trial.
We're here because DNA testing is going to cause another year or two delay in executing Mr. Noling.
The defense also requested that Nathan Chesley's story finally be reviewed by the court.
I was supposed to go in front of a judge and show the signed affidavit just to be heard. Prosecutor got that blocked.
I really object to the appellant here claiming that this alternative suspect has confessed by some way. He was somebody that police ruled out very early. And then some 20 years later, they produced this affidavit from a foster child who happened to live in the same foster home. And it would be inadmissible hearsay of this Nathan Chesley anyway. Right. I mean, in no way that's coming in at trial.
They're not interested in finding out who did it. Once they have somebody, that's it. They weren't interested.
Mr. Chesley has never testified. It's not true that the Court of Common Pleas has rejected his testimony as incredible or inadmissible. It's never been heard.
At the end, testing was denied on both the ring boxes and the shell casings.
This baffles me, and it baffles me why a prosecutor like Vic Vellucci wouldn't say, okay, let's hear it. We are so convinced we have the right man, we are not afraid to put this case under a microscope and really look at it.
The more that I learned about the facts of the case, the more shocked I was that he had been convicted, that he was still on death row, that he was still in prison even at all. It seemed clear based on the totality of the record that he was 100% innocent of this crime. With a man's life at stake, why would you not want to know every fact? Why would you put your head in the sand about evidence that could potentially resolve what happened here?
Tyrone Noling has been on death row for more than 23 years. 18 when arrested, he is now nearing 50 years old. Gary St. Clair has served 26 years for the Hardig murder. he will be eligible for parole in 2022. Joey D'Alessandro was released after 12 years and is now a free man.
Are you going on the assumption it was some kind of intruder?
That's what we believe.
Ever since Sheriff Howe dismissed them as suspects in 1990, the case against Noling has been driven by the county prosecutor's lead investigator, Ron Craig.
I very much wanted to interview Ron Craig about this, particularly because all three point the finger at Ron Craig as being the person who orchestrated the entire case against Tyrone Noling. That's a really serious accusation to make. I mean, it's malpractice.
We've got layers of defense attorneys, from trial to appellate, pointing a finger at Ron Craig, saying he's the bad actor in this case.
You know, sometimes these questionings get aggressive. It's the nature of the beast.
Okay.
You're not sitting down here with school children. You're sitting down here with murderers. They have obvious reasons to lie and to protect themselves. So sometimes the questioning gets aggressive. It's not unusual, and it's not illegal. I mean, neither is it illegal to use ruses or falsehoods in the course of the questioning. I mean, it's an acceptable tactic.
Wouldn't you let me talk to Ron Craig?
No.
Why?
Part of their job is being able to do it without fear of having to be interrogated or questioned by the press later.
All of the charges that have been made against Ron Craig by these young men about him threatening them, terrifying them, leaving them with evidence so they could get more details. If I were a cop, I would absolutely want to defend myself against such allegations. According to what he told me, Prosecutor Vellucci loses no sleep over the allegation that his investigators' tactics put an innocent man on death row.
You do your job. I'm lost to understand why you're wasting your time with this, but that's your time and whatever you want to do.
Vicky Buckwalter has found other cases of questionable convictions connected to Victor Viglucci and Ron Craig.
This guy came into my office and he said that his brother had been wrongfully convicted. Lo and behold, when we started looking into the case, it was the same exact prosecutor and the same exact investigator, Ron Craig. It was like deja vu. We were hearing all of these same things over and over, how they were trying to get people to change testimony and how they were coercing. For this to happen twice, same investigators, same tactics. This is how these guys are getting these convictions, and I can only imagine how many other cases are won this way.
Prosecutor Victor Viglucci and investigator Ron Craig did not respond to numerous requests for comment.
Still have never talked to Tyrone Noling. I want to contact him and let him know that I know he's innocent, but I don't want it to look like I know the guy or I have any skin in the game, because I don't. If they execute Tyrone Noling, I don't know mentally how I'll be able to handle that, being that I know I could have stopped that years ago. That'll be real difficult, because I should have stuck around.
Hopefully, Tyrone Noling will get exonerated. It'll fall towards me. I'll be processed out of the prison, too. And obviously, now get out of there, I'm going to try and find my son. He's, I think, 31 now. He's born in 87. He's 31. He's out there somewhere. I'm going to go look for him, too. Yep.
I have a conscience about what I did. This is a guy that I did the most ultimate wrong to. And even at that age, you can understand that you're damning somebody to death. Every moment, I know where he's at. And I know in my heart that I put him there.